His preference for living outside the city by a lake, surrounded by nature, accords perfectly with everything one is likely to read about Japan. And his general eccentricity, shall we say, use the word without loading it in any sense, eccentricity goes with the Japanese tradition of the sage or the special person who lives apart from other people, subsists on nothing but acorns and rainwater and things of that sort. All those things make me feel that his way of living, his eccentric way of living, was intelligible in terms of that kind of Japanese person of the past, and I suppose the present too.
In spring, everything becomes drowsy. The cat forgets to chase the mouse. Men forget that they have debts. Sometimes they even forget how to locate their own souls and fall into a stupor. When, however, I gazed far out over that sea of rape blossoms, I came to my senses. And when I heard the song of the lark, the mist cleared, and I found my soul again. Oh, this is real happiness, when you think thus and reach such a pitch of happiness. That is poetry.
That's Glenn Gould himself, reading from the Japanese novel by Natsume Soseki, The Three-Cornered World. He recorded it for CBC Radio's Book Time 10 months before he died, at age 50, in October 1982. It was, as you will hear, a very special book to him. Glenn Gould, the eccentric, who plunged his hands into scalding water before he played, who loved the night and the Canadian North. A Japanese sage? Decide for yourself as we explore his affinity to things Japanese. This program is called Inner Awareness, Glenn Gould and the Japanese Connection. It's prepared and presented by Ray Oyama.
I grew up in Toronto, Glenn Gould City, listening to his recordings, watching him on television, and hearing him on radio. A couple of times, I saw him walking on the University of Toronto campus. It was spring, but he was bundled up in an overcoat, and he was wearing a peaked cap. Somehow, there was a beauty in his solitude, in his strangeness. Looking at him, I sensed something Japanese about him. Then I began to search. I found out Glenn Gould wrote haiku poetry, had about 24 books relating to Japan in his personal library, loved Japanese movies, explored Japanese music, and is almost a cult figure in Japan. What was he looking for? Most of Gould's Japanese interests developed after 1964, the year a dramatic decision changed his life forever. He was 32 years old and a brilliant concert pianist with a successful career when he walked away from it all. 4 years later, in a recorded conversation, interviewer John McClure asked him about his decision.
Glenn, right here in New York, where we're talking, I know, personally, 6 impresarios dying to present you in concerts all across the country, your pick of locations. They offer to pay you any fee that you name. Why do you deny them all?
Because it's not a very enticing prospect, John. It's a very flattering one, I suppose, but it's not an enticing prospect.
The life of a glamorous concert artist?
Is hideous, is dead. I couldn't conceive of going back to that life. I was part of it for 8 or 9, whatever it was. Rather unpleasant years, rather traumatic years which I did it because I felt it was a very good experience and perhaps necessary in the sense of creating an audience which might perhaps buy my recordings. But it was an experience that I wanted to be rid of and to shuck off as quickly as I could. And when that moment came, I did it. And I think it would be a terribly retrogressive step to retreat back into the embrace of the concert.
The author of a biography on Gould, Otto Friedrich.
The pianist is there on stage with all eyes on him and all attention focused on him, and he's got to do from memory something that's quite difficult. He thought, and I think rightly, that the people in the audience were kind of waiting for him to make a mistake. He called it the last blood sport. And Gould hated that aspect of playing concerts. It all happened kind of gradually. I mean, he never announced, I will never again play in public. He just gave his concert in Los Angeles and then went back to Canada and didn't play anymore. He talked about retiring for about 10 years, but it was something he was too nervous to do right away. And when he did finally do it, I think it was a great relief. He did actually give concerts, they just weren't for audiences. For example, he would play in a TV studio and the technicians would be there, but he didn't have that terrible grind of, flying into Toledo and putting on his tuxedo and going to some strange concert hall and encounter hundreds of people who would all come to watch him make spectacle.
When it was finally over, there was no grand farewell concert, just a quiet exit. Even the city where his last concert took place is in doubt. Was it Los Angeles or Chicago? Sound technician and friend, Lorne Tulk.
I believe it was in Seattle. Now, I've heard from various other sources that it was elsewhere, but he told me, or I'm almost positive, my memory serves me that it was in Seattle. He went to the Seattle airport, having had a rather bad night's sleep, which was not unusual for him, and he saw the airplane out on the tarmac. And he said he took one look at the airplane, and he literally was just shaking all over and said, I can't get on this. I'm never getting on another airplane. As you know, he was a white-knuckle flyer anyway, but all the years of stress and everything apparently culminated at the Seattle airport. And so he went back into the airport and he rented a car and decided he would make his way back. Now, that meant driving literally across the continent, approximately 3,000 miles, back to Toronto. People were looking for him. He didn't want to be found. He wanted a few days to come down off this 9-year fear that he'd been living with and to just relax and drive back home. That's where he was, driving home.
Driving home. It became a journey inward, a chance to calm himself, to reflect. It was 1964, the same year a Japanese film, The Woman in the Dunes, won international acclaim. If Gould didn't see the film then, he certainly did later, studying it frame by frame, again and again. In the film, a man disappears from his futile, busy life in Tokyo. He's on a journey. Looking for a place to stay the night, the man ends up in a world from which there is no escape. He becomes the prisoner of a woman, living in the intense heat of a sand dune. Every day, alone together, they must shovel the sand, which threatens to bury them alive through an avalanche. Desperate and lost, the man searches for a sense of purpose. The director of the film, The Woman in the Dunes, Hiroshi Teshigahara.
僕の映画はとても皮膚感を持ってる映像があるわけですよ。で、その皮膚感からっていうものは直に
My film can be felt in the gut.
人間はそれでも
That arouses the audience
その画面に
and draws them into the film.
ですね。
Once they are drawn in, they have to deal with the problem of solitude, loneliness, the need for community, issues of human life we all experience. They are the most important issues we face. It's in the way we manage relationships. It's in our communication with each other. In other words, the man and the woman in the film slowly unfold the realities of the human condition. Before I made the film, I had a romantic image of sand. But sand is dangerous, a powerful force that can swallow us up. Watching the sand gradually and silently piling up, Glenn Gould must have recognized the human struggle that was his own. The hardship of daily existence we all, as human beings, whether we like it or not, must endure.
For this shoulder injury, he'd gone to a doctor in Philadelphia who treated him and helped him quite a bit. And a little while after that, he was supposed to play the Emperor Concerto with Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he couldn't bring himself to go there. But the strange thing is that I found in the files this whole series of letters to Ormandy. He would begin it again and again. There were about 7 versions of the thing, all beginning, I can't bear to come to Philadelphia because it scares me. All he had to do was either go and play the Emperor Concerto or else just call up and say, I can't come, or I'm sick or something. But instead of which, he went through this self-agonizing torture of trying to write this letter, which would somehow seem very cool and suave and self-possessed, at the same time as he's explaining a really neurotic inability to go and play this concert. That competitive generation that he belonged to had a lot of famous pianists in it, and a lot of them have had various troubles. Van Cliburn, as you know, retired from the stage for, like 10 years. In fact, he's still in a state of semi-retirement. They fall by the wayside in this terribly competitive, difficult, awkward, unpleasant life. And Gould, in a sense, was preserving himself by abandoning all that.
Self-preservation, and maybe something more. In the film and the novel, The Woman in the Dunes, the man, feeling imprisoned, sets up a sand trap. If he could catch a crow, attach an SOS message to its feet, maybe someone would rescue him. He names the trap Hope. But the man also discovers by making this trap that it's possible to extract water from the arid sand. He learns how to make the life of solitude work for him. Gould loved the film, but he also read the novel, and in it he may have found a pattern for his own life. There are a few in modern-day Japan who carry on the tradition of the eccentric sage living and creating in solitude. The author of The Woman in the Dunes is one, Kobo Abe.
その結果として水が砂の中での生活ですから、水が非常に貴重ですよね。
When you're surrounded by sand, water is precious. The discovery of water in the sand was one possibility open to that man in the story. But how he utilizes the water is a different issue. I think that kind of discovery is open to us all as human beings and gives us a reason to go on living. Like Glenn Gould, I don't like the concert stage atmosphere. If the performer doesn't have confidence in the kind of people who go to the concert hall to hear him play, the act of performing itself creates emptiness. But in the terms I understand as a novelist, it's possible to exist in solitude without seeing anyone. That's why I really understand Glenn Gould's feeling that he wanted to sit in front of the mixing board in the studio rather than a performer. I think he really was an artist.
Glenn Gould, the artist. More and more, it seemed that Gould needed solitude to survive. This is from a diary of a Japanese medieval poet-priest, written after he abandoned the world. The hermit crab chooses to live in little shells because it well knows the size of its body. Only in a hut built for the moment can one live without fears. There's a Buddhistic belief that by retiring from the world, one can transcend the present life, but not without regret. A poem by the great haiku poet Basho expresses the emotions that solitude can arouse. Scholar of Japanese literature, Donald Keene.
The poem Kare eda ni karasu no tomaritaru ya aki no kure. I've translated this as, on the withered branch a crow has alighted, nightfall in autumn. First of all, it's a monochromatic scene. The branch is withered, it is not green. The crow, of course, is black. It is a time when colors are lost, when the colors one sees during the day disappear into the gray or even the black of night. This moment when the crow alights on the withered branch defines the nature of nightfall in autumn. But there's another way to translate it. The last line, aki no kure, can also mean the night of autumn, meaning the end of autumn, the very end, just before the winter comes. It is the time when the trees lose their leaves. If this were a poem about nightfall in autumn at the beginning of autumn, or at the time of autumn when the leaves were their most brilliant, it would be less interesting. And this is the poem about the end of autumn before the coming of winter. It's an extremely lonely, extremely beautiful poem. I think this comes as close to an ideal of solitariness, of loneliness, the beauty of loneliness as one can find in Basho.
The year he wrote that haiku poem in 1692, Basho planted outside his cottage where he lived in solitude a tree. It became known as the Basho tree, and when the wind blew, the leaves shivered, reflecting the poet's sensitivity. Glenn Gould's cousin and kindred spirit, Jessie Grieg.
I think he was very lonely. I think he was lonely as a child, and then I think he was very lonely as a man. He would not admit that, but he was, because he would go away at Christmas, say, and, you know, he knew the family would welcome him, but he wouldn't have any part of that. He had to stand apart. But he'd go away and tell me he was going to have a wonderful time, and he'd come back or phone, and he hadn't had such a wonderful time. And he was home, and he said, "Don't tell anybody I've come home." He didn't want others to realize that he had been lonely. I think that the potential was there in his personality to be a loner, and he did say that he needed solitude. It wasn't something that he just manufactured. He needed it to go on from where he was.
The great poet, the haiku poet of the 17th century, Basho, shut his gate and didn't see people for several years. The desire to be away from people was very congenial to the Japanese of the past, because there they would find themselves, or the truth that they're looking for, the way of the Buddha perhaps, that they couldn't find when surrounded by loving wife, children, and so on. In the past, sometimes Japanese physically could not get away from other people, but they were able somehow to find solitude. The practice of sitting in meditation, zazen, was a very important part of these people's lives. When they cut themselves off from other people who might be actually only a few feet away, but it was as if they were completely isolated. The idea of being lonely is something to be sought after, because in this state of solitude, or a solitude one is aware of, one can first find oneself.
Very often during the course of a year, you'll take off, either by car or by train, into the northern wastes of Canada to look for, I don't know what, solitude or wildness. Do you like cities or hate them?
I do hate them. And I don't think there are as many inconsistencies as you'd like to find, John. First of all, the recording experience is the most womb-like experience that one can possibly have in music. It is a very cloistered way of life. Mm-hmm. And indeed, I've given up all that was non-cloistered in my musical life. So that there is no very great inconsistency there. The fact of having to make a recording in a large city like Toronto or like New York, where I most often make them, is inevitable at this particular moment. I don't know quite how that could be circumvented. I don't know that I'd want to. I think that 2 days in New York make me appreciate the North Woods of Canada. So perhaps that's a good idea.
Glenn Gould loved driving in the North Woods, with the volume of his car radio at full blast, conducting with one hand and steering with the other. It could be music by Richard Strauss, or even the singing of Petula Clark.
Reach up to the sky.
He thought she was a sign of the times. Gould loved the freedom of staying in motels, eavesdropping on conversations in roadside diners, and the beauty of the Canadian landscape. In the middle of a busy city in downtown Toronto, he lived a cloistered existence, controlling what he did and those who had access to him. He was a thoroughly modern, high-tech hermit. Everything was on his own terms. Close friend and business associate during the last 10 years of Gould's life, Ray Roberts.
When he wanted to be alone in his own thoughts, with the purity of being able to get away from all the distractions of the world, he could just turn that all off. He had the control of doing that. We had a lady who never did anything physically, but at one point used to write him 3 or 4 letters a day from Texas, and threatened to come up and sit at Young and Bloor and start shooting people until he came out and married her. That's one of the things that he used to use me for a little bit, because I would phone and sometimes make the nasty type phone call, and that was me who was yelling, not Glenn Gould.
Well, he tried to lay down the rules for all his relationships with people, what he would do, when he would do it, how he would do it, and so forth. Take it on the simplest area of telephone calls. I mean, you would call him, you'd get his answering machine, and then he would call you back. That means that he's talking on the phone to you when he wants to talk to you, not when you want to talk to him. I think it was really always there. I mean, it's an essential personality trait, and it becomes important in his recordings. For example, he had all the recording machinery established in Toronto, so he would never have to leave, and so he could do the recording himself rather than come down to New York and have Columbia do it for him. He wouldn't be interviewed unless he could write it all out in advance, with the result that all his interviews are, in a sense, self-interviews. He had to be in charge of both the questions and the answers, so he could control everything. And in this way, he put himself in charge, so to speak, of everything that he did, and that was very important to him.
How long since you've given a concert?
It's about 4 years now. And they've been 4 of the very best years of my life. 4 years in which I've come to terms with music and with myself qua music in a way that I didn't realize was possible before. I couldn't possibly go back, I think, to the concert without losing something of that coming to termness. And I wouldn't be prepared to do that.
You mean it frees you to go on to something else?
It frees you to go on to something else. It also intensifies the experience. It means, first of all, that you cover an immense terrain of music. You can look down from a fairly considerable height upon a vast literature that's spread out before you, as you cannot do when you're going from Poughkeepsie to Nyack and playing with the respective philharmonics, if they have such, and on to Hoboken and do it again the next night. That experience does not exist and cannot exist in that particular framework because a tremendous conservatism takes over the concert performer. They're really afraid to try out the Beethoven Fourth if the Beethoven Third happens up till then to have been their specialty. That's the piece of which they've had success on Long Island by George. It's going to be the experience which brings them success in Connecticut as well. Tremendous conservatism and a stagnation sets in. At least it certainly did for me, and I think it's true of most people.
You mean you find you have more options, more choice as an artist this way?
Well, you have, first of all, a means of really encountering music as a totally enjoyable and personal experience. But it also makes you aware of it sounds a little corny, of the magnitude of music.
You mean you become less of a performer and more of a musician?
Exactly.
Your encounters are broadened.
Exactly.
He was enjoying the complete autonomy of having his own studio, choosing and expanding his repertoire, transcribing for the piano the work of composers like Wagner, whom he loved, and playing the transcriptions himself. He used to say to his cousin Jessie, "Stretch your mind." Gould found this new magnitude in making recordings in his own studio, radio documentaries, and writing. Freedom meant control. There is, however, another kind of control. A form of self-control as it's practiced in Zen Buddhism. Through solitude and discipline, one can discover the inner self and cultivate the garden of one's soul. In the case of an artist, this kind of striving can result in an artistic expression that transcends the ego and enters a more spiritual realm. Zen master at Daitokuji Temple in Kyoto, Abbot Maeda. You will hear him refer to Glenn Gould as the pianist.
In Zen discipline, in the training of disciples. Although our monastery is open to the public, where training takes place is absolutely closed off. The disciples must live apart in solitude. Even if the world is changing around them, air from outside world is not allowed in. Why do we do that? Just to pull a single weed, we must focus our full concentration. When we meditate in Zazen, if the doorbell rings and the guest arrives, we don't think of the guest. We don't do that. We concentrate. In the case of the pianist, it was a matter of developing himself and striving in order to become one with Bach. Therefore, solitude was not his ultimate goal. He needed solitude to reach beyond himself, to transform himself into Bach. That's where I feel there is a parallel with Zen. I don't know whether he practiced Zen meditation or not, but if you look at it from our point of view, those of us who practice Zen can relate to him. In this way, the way of Zen and the artist's devotion to music are also the same.
To enter music, the pianist tries to become one with the composer. It's been observed that no one plays Bach with such intensity and electricity as Gould. Abbot Maeda calls this devotion. Glenn Gould played the stock market as well as he played the piano. Retirement from the concert stage could have meant a life of luxury and ease. Instead, he chose a simpler life, focused on his art. Harmony, respect, purity, tranquility. A phrase used in the traditional Japanese tea ceremony, chanoyu. It's one of the arts, along with haiku, ikebana, or the art of flower arrangement, and no drama that came out of Zen culture. Simplicity was an aesthetic ideal sought by the great tea master and practitioner of Zen, Zen no Rikyu, in the 16th century. It's interpreted by the Japanese words sabi and wabi. Professor Donald Keene of Columbia University explains.
Sabi is rather like the verb sabiru, which means to become rusty, and it suggests an object which has been used a long time. It's unobtrusive. It isn't new. It isn't glittering. The age of the object becomes part of its importance, its value. The ideal of wabi is similar in that it is choosing simplicity, choosing the very barest thing, even though one is financially able to buy the most luxurious. One chooses the simple one, hiding extravagance rather than flaunting it. And this, of course, is very typical of Japanese aesthetics. Both would have appealed to Glenn Gould. Or about the piano he found for his last recording session in New York, a piano that had been in this shop for a long time, had been pushed to the side. People who had the shop didn't even think of showing it to him, but that was the one that he wanted, on which he played his ultimate recording of the Goldberg Variations. This fondness for the old, the unobtrusive, the things that have come to be associated with oneself. They're not simply inanimate objects that you can buy, but things which respond to you. The piano might be battered, but it knew Glenn Gould. The piano was a sense an intimate of his, and he would no more discard the piano just because it was battered or the keys were discolored or whatever, than he would discard a friend. It was part of him.
Again, Lorne Tulk.
He was not taken in by materialistic trappings. He didn't go out and envy or desire or lust after a big car or a color television or a fancy VCR or anything like that. And yet, he would fall in love with certain pieces of clothing, for example, a specific shirt or maybe a particular pair of trousers. And then there was true of shoes. I mean, he could get a pair of shoes that he was enormously comfortable in. And he was quite capable, really, of sitting down and cutting out a piece of cardboard to put into this pair of shoes because it had a hole in it. He didn't care that it had a hole in it. He cared about the fact that they were wonderful, great shoes. They fit him so well. And, you know, even though they had a hole in them, he wanted to keep them and preserve them.
その人はピアニストとしての道を全うしてるから striving on his path because he is focused and has really achieved. People around him recognize his greatness. However, at the beginning, I think they thought he was eccentric. But if he didn't devote himself to that extreme, he couldn't transform himself into Bach. Those disciplining themselves through Zen are also the same. Unless you're called eccentric by others during your development, it's not possible to find the true way. If you wear shoes, they're only there to warm your feet, not because of fashion. For the pianist, too, the shoes are there only for that reason, to warm the feet. That's why, if he had become a Zen monk, he would have been a great one.
The months and days are the travelers of eternity. The years that come and go are also voyagers. Words by the Japanese poet Basho in his account of a journey called The Narrow Road to Oku. The word Oku can mean inner recess, a spiritual journey of the self, or it can be translated as the deep north. Glenn Gould had taken a 1,000-mile journey to Canada's north, as far north as any train could take him. That journey resulted in the idea of North, the first of 3 radio documentaries on the theme of solitude. It was originally heard December 28, 1967, on this CBC program, Ideas. Gould loved traveling on trains. Bill Foley remembers an encounter with him.
At one time, I was traveling on the Canadian National train known as the Ocean Limited from Halifax to Montreal. And after dinner, I visited the parlor car, and I noticed that Glenn Gould was there, seated alone. So I walked over to him and introduced myself, and we began a very pleasant conversation. I should have mentioned earlier that he wore black gloves, which were cut off at about the first joint of each finger. He seemed to be quite unaware of that. Well, anyway, he suddenly told me to wait, and he left the parlor car, and then he came back and presented me with Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, played by Gould under the direction of Leopold Stokowski. After I had received the beautiful record, I felt somewhat obligated. I decided I would send him a copy of The Three-Cornered World, in reciprocity. Well, I thought myself that the book would suit Glenn Gould because The Man in the Three-Cornered World was a painter, a poet, and I felt that he would reach out to Glenn Gould and they would be speaking a common language.
A novel about an artist in which Glenn Gould may have seen a reflection of himself. A Japanese novel. In The Three-Cornered World by Natsume Soseki, the hero, a poet and a painter, sets out on a journey of his own. The translator of The Three-Cornered World explains the title and Soseki's definition of an artist. Alan Turney.
An artist is a person who lives in the triangle which remains after the angle which we may call common sense has been removed from this four-cornered world, which is why I chose the title Three-Cornered World, to express the world of the artist, although it wasn't an expression that Soseki himself used. But he did say we live in a four-cornered world. I suppose one of the cornerstones of the world that we all live in is common sense. Don't do that, it's not sensible. Do that because it's sensible. And he says if you're going to live like that, you can't be an artist. You have to throw away the idea of common sense. And his own idea, which he believed very much, was that you had to dive right into whatever it is you were going to describe. And the expression in English, fools rush in where wise men fear to tread, comes to mind. That in that sense you have to be what would be described by the average person as foolhardy. I mean, a catalyst is something which itself should not change. But it's very difficult, I think, for an artist to be a pure catalyst. I mean, like Glenn Gould was a vehicle for Bach's music, but he couldn't remain unmoved by it. And I think that's what Soseki is talking about. If you really want to get in and find the beauty of things, you might drive yourself absolutely insane in the process. But on the other hand, if you're an artist, can you afford always to stand back? you have to jump in. And that's the three-cornered world, inhabited by Soseki and other artists, I presume.
Journeys can be dangerous. The artist can lose himself in the world of his making. And in the eyes of the ordinary world in which the rest of us live, he may be viewed as eccentric or insane. When Glenn Gould sat down to record Soseki's novel for CBC Radio, he chose passages that meant the most to him, about perspective, beauty, and the artist. He selected the Japanese music, a Zen piece composed for the shakuhachi flute called A Bell Ringing in the Empty Sky, and he provided his own introduction.
The Three-Cornered World was written in 1906, but its action, if one can use that term with regard to so static a work, is set 2 years earlier, at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. The war plays no direct part in the novel, at least not until the last few pages, but at that point its rather jarring denouement has an uncanny similarity to the World War I motif, which brings to a close another great Alpine novel, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. The Three-Cornered World is, among other things, about meditation versus action, detachment versus duty, about Western versus Eastern value systems, about the perceived perils of modernism. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, and I'm going to read just a few excerpts from its first chapter. Going up a mountain track, I fell to thinking. Approach everything rationally and you become harsh.
Gould's cousin, Jessie Grieg. My earliest memory was one of an introduction to the Three-Cornered World, and Glenn read it to me, and he read it all in telephone conversations. I think it took 2 evenings, and he read me the whole book, and he loved it, and he often went back to various parts of the book and referred to it. You know, when we read a book, we read it and then we put it away for a while. But he was always bringing it out and quoting from it, always.
In the camera of your innermost soul. After 20 years of life, I realized that this is a world worth living in. At 25, I saw that just as light and darkness are but opposite sides of the same thing, so wherever the sunlight falls, it must of necessity cast a shadow. Today, my thoughts are these. In the depths of joy dwells sorrow, and the greater the happiness, the greater the pain. Try to tear joy and sorrow apart, and you lose your hold on life. Try to cast them to one side and the world crumbles. Money is important, but be that as it may, when it accumulates, does it not become a worry which attacks you, even in sleep? Love is a delight, yet should the delights of love piling one upon another begin to bear down on you, then you will yearn for those days long before you knew them.
Friend and business associate, Ray Roberts.
He referred to it often. Did he run his life by it? I don't think so, but when things got stressful, as they always do, I think he would sit down and read it quietly. You know, good writing and good feelings and thoughts can bring an order to your life. And I think it helped Glenn bring an order to his.
One thing I wanted to confirm with you, what were the two books that were found next to his bedside when he had the stroke?
One was the Bible, and also the Three-Cornered World, which he loved.
The Three-Cornered World was part of Glenn Gould's life for 15 years, and it was with him almost until the moment he died from a stroke. From Lady Murasaki's 11th century novel, The Tale of Genji, I see that this world of ours, too, is like a floating bridge of dreams. A bridge, not only between life and death, but between art and life. It's not easy to travel back and forth on the bridge without help. Jessie Grieg.
You know, he was living in a different world. His world and our world was different, but I think most times he used common sense. When he didn't, when he was irrational, I think it was related to the world that he lived in, not my world. I think that his relationship with me was a bridge between the two worlds. I always thought that's what he thought. I was the bridge between his world and mine.
When I think of it as happening to somebody else, it seems that the idea of me soaked to the skin, surrounded by countless driving streaks of silver, and moving through a vast gray expanse, would make an admirable poem. Only when I completely forget my material existence and view myself from a purely objective standpoint can I, as a figure in a painting, blend into the beautiful harmony of my natural surroundings. The moment, however, I feel annoyed because of the rain or miserable because my legs are weary with walking, then I have already ceased to be a character in a poem or a figure in a painting, and I revert to the uncomprehending, insensitive man in the street I was before.
Glenn Gould, reading from The Three-Cornered World by Natsume Soseki. A man walking in the rain, seen from a great distance. Only in art, says the novelist, do order and harmony prevail. Rain becomes silver. A man is integrated into the landscape. But in life, there's still the day-to-day struggle we all must face. The record of Gould's struggle exists in notebooks and journals that he kept, and they are now in the National Library of Canada. His biographer, Otto Friedrich.
The really last years of his life, he had a lot of health problems. He was taking all kinds of drugs. Doctors prescribe these things, and we don't know what all the side effects of them are.
Was he always seeing doctors?
Yes.
How frequently?
Toward the end, almost constantly. He had, I think, 4 regular doctors. And so he had this enormous list of drugs he was taking. Let me just look at that here. I wrote them down. He was taking Aldomet for high blood pressure, Nembutal for sleep, tetracycline and chloromycetin for his constant colds and infections, and Serpacil and Largostil and Stelazine and Restaclin and Librax and Clonidine and Fiorinal and Inderal and Inocid and Aristocort cream and Neocortef and Xyloprin and Butazolidin and Bactra and Septra. It goes on and on like that. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing all these things right. But as you can see, every doctor had a new idea, and he took them all. But they're all in those notepads. He wrote them all down. with these pads in front of him. It was like chain of association. He would just write down whatever came to his head, and he would sort of diagnose himself endlessly. For somebody to write all that down in longhand it's really a bizarre form of self-description, self-analysis. But that's how self-obsessed he was.
What was he looking for in life to go through all that solitude, his constantly exploring things? What do you think he was really looking for?
If I had to say one word, I would say tranquility or serenity, peace. I think he refers at some point to in his youth, and he didn't like life at school, and he used to go to some church and listen to the hymns. I think the phrase he used was something like the peace that is not of this earth. And that's what he was very much looking for.
Let me see, can I describe that? He had that look of satisfaction, I think I would call it, completely engaged in playing the piano. He was completely engaged, peaceful and very happy. A lot of the time he had his head up and he would be rotating anti-clockwise. He'd be sort of swiveling around from the hips on this little chair that he was sitting on, which he was balancing on. And he would be rotating in a sort of counterclockwise fashion, I think. He seemed to be in a trance. That's a good way of putting it.
Did he ever call himself an artist?
Well, I think Glenn knew exactly where he stood, and I think he knew that he was an artist. I think he was conscious of all of these things. They were simply part and parcel of this person, of this being. He was certainly aware of who he was.
A tall man, all 6 feet of him, stooped over the keyboard on the old chair his father gave to him. He looked as though he were in a state of ecstasy. Perhaps he did find inner peace and fulfillment when his fingers touched the keyboard, when music created rhythm inside his head, when he connected with the pulse and cadences deep inside himself. Glenn Gould believed that the goal of art is the gradual, lifelong construction of a state of wonder and serenity. He may have found this serenity in Japanese culture and in its highest aesthetic, Yugen. It's the art of the beautiful, achieved through control, elegance, depth, and mystery. When you enter this realm, you become a master. Perhaps that's why Glenn Gould is revered by the Japanese. He's recognized as a master. He was only 50 years old when he died, October 4th, 1982. His artistry is timeless, a legacy to us all.
On Ideas Tonight, you heard Inner Awareness, Glenn Gould and the Japanese Connection. The program was prepared and presented by Ray Uyama. Production assistant, Gail Brownell. Sound technician, Lon Tulk. The producer was Marilyn Powell. Special thanks to the Glenn Gould estate, Takeshi Sakamoto and Kori Koritap, Noria Olga and Tom Shipton. The executive producer of Ideas is Bernie Lucht, and I'm Lister Sinclair.